start recording. And I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Jamie Asaye FitzGerald, and I am the Director of Poets and Writers California office in our Readings and Workshops West program. I'm here with my colleague, Ricardo Hernandez, who will be helping me with the program for today and our discussion after our wonderful guest speaker. Ricardo is zooming in from Brooklyn, New York, and I am zooming in from Los Angeles, California. And I'd like to acknowledge that we operate on the traditional lands of the Tongva, Tataviam, and Chumash peoples of Los Angeles, and the Lenape, Rockaway, and Canarsie people of New York City. Some of you have been to our town halls in the past, and for those of you who haven't, I'll just give you a little bit of background. Since the beginning of the pandemic, and with the support of the California Arts Council, Poets and Writers has been presenting community building events virtually, including check-ins for writers and literary presenters and town halls. These events help us to fulfill our mission, which is to foster the professional development of poets and writers, to promote communication throughout the literary community, and help create an environment in which literature can be appreciated by the widest possible public. These community building events go hand in hand with our mini grants program, which helps pay fees to writers who give live public readings and teach creative writing workshops. We operate this program in California and New York State, as well as in 8 cities outside of these states. For today, Ricardo will share the agenda in the chat, and we invite you to also freely use the chat to express appreciation, to ask questions, and to share resources and information throughout the course of the event. We'll begin with our guest speaker, and then we'll have a short time for question and answer with our guest. And hopefully there will still also be some time after that for a little bit of community sharing for you who are here today to introduce your organization or events that you might like the group to know about. The event is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel. We invite you to keep your cameras on during the open discussion and announcement section of the event, but it is entirely optional. And before we move forward, I thought that this would be a really good opportunity for us to share a moment of silence in honor of all those who've been lost to gun violence, including the recent tragedies in Buffalo, New York, Uvalde, Texas, Laguna Woods, California, and I'm sorry to say, to add to the list, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Thank you very much. So I frequently get requests for someone to speak on the topic, on the difficult topic of trauma. I think a lot of writers work with populations who have experienced trauma on different levels. And it's just frequently commented on in the feedback surveys that I get after these events. They would really like to hear from a writer who can speak on that topic. So for a long time, I've kept this in mind, and I've sort of kept my eyes open for someone who I thought could do that in a way that would be useful to writers and literary presenters, And I think I've found that person in Allison Adelle Hedge Coke, who is here with us today and has generously agreed to speak with us about her work in the field of narrative medicine and its connection to writing as a way of processing trauma. One might say that any moment is the right moment for this conversation, but of course, the current moment feels like the right moment for this conversation as we find ourselves coping with multiple collective traumas as a nation, and for some more personal traumas as well. So I hope that this talk today will be healing and empowering, as somber as the topic is. And one of the small factors, very small, but still a factor in knowing Allison was the right person to open us to this conversation was her email signature, where she has written the following: "Weird times, be kind." So I'll introduce Allison. Allison Adelle Hedge Coke's poetry books include The Year of the Rat, Dog Road Woman, Off-Season City Pipe, Blood Run, Burn, Streaming, and most recently, Look at This Blue, which I have here, and I will show you the beautiful cover. Look at This Blue, which is just out from Coffee House Press. And I encourage you all to get her books. She is also the author of a memoir, Rock Ghost, Willow Deer. Hedge Coke is a distinguished professor at the University of California, Riverside, yay Riverside, where she teaches for creative writing and narrative medicine for the School of Medicine. She directs along the Chaparral, UC Riverside Writers Week, the Sand Hill Crane Retreat, and the occasional Riverside Woods Streets Salon at her home. She has many honors. Just the 2021 honors include induction into the Texas Institute of Letters, the George Garrett Award, an Emeritus Return Black Earth Institute Fellowship, and a Legacy Artist Fellowship from the California Arts Council. Hedge Coke has performed all over the world and has worked for decades with marginalized, underserved groups, including incarcerated youth, and in state hospitals, cancer centers, domestic violence shelters, refugee and migrant camps, and has clinical practice with writing for many health conditions and locations, rural, reservation, and urban. She came of age working in fields, factories, and waters, and has lived in California off and on since 1980. Welcome, Allison.
Thank you, Jamie. So I'm going to briefly speak to the practice of narrative medicine, what it is, and move you into hopefully having something to take from this session to work with as well, so that when you feel the need to move somewhere through a particular situation or trauma or event that you'd like to transition, that you can apply and or help somebody else. So I've been practicing in the field since it was called bibliotherapy. Back at that time, it sounded like we were doing something with books in a library, and they came up with the wonderful title, Narrative Medicine, which is such more fitting, I think, in some ways. So narrative medicine is a discipline that allows us to work with what is story, what is narrative in a narrativizing culture, humanity, and to begin to ascertain and do detective work to find underpinnings and nuances in story, so that in a place where a patient client is revealing their story as they've come in for healing of some sort, that the practitioner is able to look through certain things that are happening in the story that are maybe a distraction, and see what the underpinnings are and what's really happening in a deeper level. So it applies close reading technique, which a lot of writers have at hand and are able to move into rather quickly. It also allows a physician or a physician in training, when I'm teaching at our School of Medicine, I often have residents, to be able to assess a situation beyond the 8-minute limit of their agenda. They have 8 minutes, they're supposed to go in and work with each patient and move on. And oftentimes it's related to pharmaceuticals and other things that can be handled quickly. And we just know that life and trauma and medical situations are not that simple. So it allows somebody to slow down a bit, to read through what's happening and to notice nuances, which may be cultural, may be generational, maybe social, economical, and begin to understand what the story actually is and the way that it's presented. So it also deals with reading body language and nuance in character traits and aesthetic of presentation of story. So not just the written word or the spoken word, but what's with that delivery and performance of the word as well. And on the other hand of narrative medicine, working with clients and patients in various, whether it's trafficked people, people in domestic violence, somebody in a terminal cancer situation, criminally insane in the state hospital, etc. The idea is to allow a person to find dignity, to find coping, to find some sense of continuance and some sense of continual ability beyond what we have as physical realm or what we have as mental or social realm that we believe we're working with. And so it allows somebody to find continuity, which is the first step in coping oftentimes. Some of you may be familiar with the Wendell Berry poem, I live my life in, I'm sorry, I went to a Rilke poem. I live my life in growing orbits, which move out over the things of the world. Perhaps I may never achieve the last, but that will be my attempt. In the next stanza of the poem, Rilke has already taken us through this idea that the world of life has to do with goals, and he may never reach the final goal. In the next stanza, he says he's circling around the ancient tower. He's been circling 1,000 years, so he's clearly no longer human at this point, but humanity itself. And I still don't know if I'll be a falcon, a great storm, or a song. So we have 3 open-ended metaphors at the end to choose from. So what is a falcon? It's a bird of prey. It can see 2 miles maybe. A mouse, it's there. We can't fathom what that vision is, but it's also a predator, so it's also carnivorous. So is it visionary he's speaking about, or is it something that might be predatory? A song can break your heart. A song can cause you to feel romantic, joyful, chills up your back because it's so meaningful. It has a range of emotions that you can receive from it. And a great storm could bring a deluge to a drought place like California. We have a serious drought here, and it can cause relief. If it hits in an area where there is tornadoes and hurricanes that are more likely, it can cause great destruction. So in a very short 8 lines of poetry, we've got this introspective work happening, which is a narrative medicine, which is taking us from our own reality into a deeper sense of self, which brings us to humanity. So therein lies the dignity, coping, continuity, and what's beyond that, this ancient tower, 1,000 years of doing this, and not knowing the ending, but in not knowing and offering the 3 metaphors at the end, there's some sense of either direction you go, there's an intentionality there. So there's a cause, there's a purpose at the end, which is kind of interesting. The Wendell Berry poem that I was going to refer to has slipped my mind right now. I'll recite it for you, but I'll try to put it in the chat before we're done today. You probably all know it. It's The Piece of Wild Things. And in that poem, he goes from having despair for the world into the natural world and moves out into this pond and finds a duck resting in its beauty on the water. And instead of saying that it's a reflection, he refers to it with the poetic device, it's beauty on the water, thus changing the scene and moving us into a deeper reality of what that animal is seeing and how it is for them. and then taking this out of the human despair and finding the beauty in nature and animals that do not tax their life with forethought or grief. It also alleviates at a time where there is a feeling. I feel above me the day blind stars waiting with their light, and for a time I rest in the grace of the world and I'm free. So just paraphrasing some of the lines from that. Again, there's this sense of transitioning from the horror of the world, the despair for the world. There's a line in it as well that refers to being afraid of what the poet's life may be and what their children's lives may be. So there's a duty that's brought up. And so it's not just me, but my children. We're thinking about COVID, school shootings, these things that we're existing in today at this time. And in the past, and the wars that have taken place and all the horrors of the earth, of humanity in general that we've moved through and are moving through at this point. And we do have despair and we have grief. These are pressures on us. These are knowns on us. And we're not just responsible for ourselves, we're responsible for our community, our neighbors, our students, our elders, our children, anyone that we might meet on the street as a stranger, and we have more ability at the time than they do, we may be responsible for. And so this creates more grief at times, more anxiety for many, many people. In the next part of the poem, going out into the wild, out into nature, to alleviate oneself about despair for humanity and those worries, and just noticing for a time that something is different about the way animals approach life than humans approach life. And he has that lovely line, for a time I rest in the grace of the world and I am free, which is simply stunning because it doesn't say forever. And again, there's the continuity. I feel above me the day blind stars waiting with their light. Before he gets to it in time, I wait in grace of the world and I'm free. So there's this sense of direction of leaving one's worries, one's arguments, one's inhibitors, one's grief, one's distrust, despair behind for just a moment and moving into something else altogether and seeing that. Okay, so that's just a little sort of nutshell about the close reading that we do as writers that can be very helpful in a narrative medicine practice, because the same way that prose, that poetry, that script affects us as readers, as audience, and that we use to translate life as writers, also affects those that we are working with in a sense of helping each other as human beings through something, whether it's a family member or a client or a patient. The essence is we're looking for solutions. We're looking for a sense of continuity that even if I leave this world tomorrow, this world will continue on. If there's a huge earthquake, she'll shake us loose and remake herself, and the animal world would probably be better for it. There's a sense of continuity there if we can allow ourselves to come to that, so that we find a sense of dignity, no matter the actualities of our life that we're facing, even if it's a terminal disease, or we're dealing with something that is not going to be something that we can overrule in life or get through in life. So even in that type of a situation, finding continuity can allow us to cope, can allow us to feel dignity for our life and our presence here at this time, and be willing to move forward and to let go when we need to let go. At other times, I have seen so many people move into a sense of writing to de-escalate trauma in life, to be able to translate trauma in life, to be able to understand trauma in life. I do want to, before I get too far into this, give you a little bit of a, I guess a caveat is a way to say it. When you are writing from trauma, one thing that people forget to say is that you can give yourself post-traumatic stress disorder if you are purging things that you have not dealt with yet in life. Many people leave traumatic events and put everything behind them and just keep going in order to survive it. It is a coping skill. It allows people to survive and to exist in the world. If that is you and that is how you have operated through trauma, the caveat from me today would be a little at a time, do what you can do. If you're suddenly unveiling hidden memories that you didn't know existed, Find somebody to do some talk therapy with, a trusted friend, a counselor, whatever fits your lifestyle, and do some other writing on the side that allows you to have some joy. And if you have to move away from it, do so. So I'm going to leave you with a few minutes talk about narrative and story as a whole. And I'll put some exercises in the chat for you to do and some links for resources. Thank you for listening. We do have narrative medicine in our School of Medicine at Riverside, and I'm really happy to teach in that program. Mostly I'm working with students who are residents. So story exists, as I like to imagine it, a big spherical circle that we reach into on an as need to know basis throughout our life. All of our ancestors have done this with a particular story. If we've been in one culture, it'll be a story that also explains that culture and how to live in that culture and what to do and what the purposes of that culture. Over a period of time in life, we've absorbed enough of the stories that exist in culture that we understand ourselves within the culture. And likewise, culture exists as sort of a separate, sort of spherical, always moving, always developing entity. And it both created story and it receives story and learns from story. So these two are inextricable. And as a narrativizing culture, humanity, human beings in general, you might say, oh, I'm going to Florida next week. Somebody else in our room here will say, I've never been to Florida. That's just how we relate to one another. We are a narrativizing culture. So in living in a narrativizing culture, when we are having hardships, when we are having pain, when we are having medical issues, when we are having any kind of traumatic event, anxiety, you name it, the first place we go is to our etic knowns, the things that make us who we are. So whether it's socioeconomic culture, generational culture, a neighborhood, an ethnic culture, national culture, whatever the culture is, and sometimes it's an amalgamation of many, we go to those knowns to understand something of ourselves or to repel it if it's causing a condition that we're also having trauma with, and back and forth to understand who we are in the world. And thus we're translating that story continually. Each time we go into a new space and we're faced with emic, our etic knowns become very familiar to us, which is why writers go and do writing residencies. They're away from home, they're in a new place. Sometimes it becomes familiar over time, and suddenly their memories are more keen. They have more clarity. They're able to access things they can't access in their living room because it's too mundane for them. So because we're living in this field and we operate in this field, it's essential for us to understand that at any time we're taking in information or we're enduring something that is difficult for us, that we have the ability as human beings to story what's happening, to detach from it enough to create the thread to translate what is happening. And this is the first step into moving into introspective space, into moving into finding a place of dignity, as they say, rising above. It's also the first step toward finding some sense of continuity, purpose, intentionality, and to develop a coping skill to deal with. I'm going to be running out of time here. It's quite a large field, as you can imagine. Does anybody have any questions before I run out of my time? And was this helpful at all to you?
Yes, you have ample time. We have ample time for questions. So if you have a question, you can put it in the chat, or you can use the reactions at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand, and then we will be able to see your hand raised. Can everybody find that reaction?
Hi, I'm not Allison Hedge Coke. My name is Sam Fernandez. Hi, Allison. It was really wonderful to hear you. I'm not sure why my box has your name on it. I think it's because of the link I clicked in the email that you sent.
Did you ever sub for me, Sam?
Did I ever sub for you?
Yeah, in a class. If you've ever subbed for me, you might have my name on your Zoom.
it's possible. That's why I'm not sure how that happened, but either way, I'm glad I got to hear you speak on this topic, and yeah, it was just really great to hear and see you. So thank you for your words and thoughts. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sam. Thank you.
Ricardo, do we have any questions in the chat that I should be aware of?
Yes, so Millicent wrote, how do you get from I don't know to dignity and the start of a solution? And Millicent, feel free to jump on the mic if you want to develop the question a little bit before Allison answers.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to throw that out there as a sort of a general question. It's been a wonderful talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Millicent, and thank you for posting the berry piece. It just ran from my mind when I was about to go into it. So I went to the Rilke instead. They both work well together. Thank you for that. I'll give you a little anecdotal bit. So when I went to work with trafficked women, I'm bringing this up because of what just happened in Tulsa. When I went to work with trafficked women in Tulsa a few years ago, I was invited to come out there and do some work with them, narrative medicine with the group. The other people who were working with the group, some of their counselors, but also other artists and such, could not figure out why I was taking so much time with the group, because they had a certain amount of time before they could get their monologues ready for a staged event. And knowing that it takes a while to move from the I don't know to dignity, it would have been unethical for me to push that as a practitioner. So there is a period of introspective work and connective work that has to occur for someone to be able to draw upon dignity or feel it even for the first time in their life, which could be the case. There's no easy route to it. It is a very subtle thing that happens over a period of moving through narrative and understanding how story works, so that in enveloping one's story from what one has moved through, which often causes all sorts of post-traumatic stress, as well as shock and other dilemmas, amnesia, you name it. One has to find the critical moment of before that time that they had, the feeling that they had. And once they've moved through a memory that has that, they can often ascertain that that feeling is still there, if they've ever felt it in their life. Now, it's at times you'll have a client and or be working with a friend who literally has never felt dignity. And so part of the work is to teach the feeling of what that means, to have a sense of wholeness, to have a sense of agency, to have a sense of internal purpose in the world, to have a sense of being okay no matter what is happening around. And it takes quite a bit to get there. So there's no easy answer for that. But it's a fantastic question. And I wish we had like hours to discuss it with the group, because it's a fantastic question. It really is.
Yeah, and I mean, how do you even get them to that point? Like, what do you do to get them to that point?
Yeah, for me, working, it depends on the group. It's always reading the room, knowing who's in the room, having a sense of assessing, as I was mentioning, clues with body language, with the way someone is delivering, patterns that people have, so that you can start to move with it and create sort of a pluralistic feeling in the room, so that there's a sense of safety. Once that is secured and there is a sense of trust, a person can start moving into deeper reflection more easily. It's very hard if someone cannot trust in a room to move into that space, because it feels vulnerable. So it's a lot of exercises to move into shared participation.
Mm-hmm. Ricardo, do we have another question in the chat?
We do. I'm not sure who to credit this to, because it's also appearing as Allison, but I'm going to read the question. How often has resistance to narrative as medicine showed up in your teaching/community? And what are supportive ways to move folks towards narrative medicine?
Oh, I think this is a different Allison. I believe it is an independent Allison with full agency. Sometimes writers sub for me and then my name is on their Zoom forever. And I'm like, this is, I didn't think of that until just a moment ago. I have a lot of guests. So Allison, another great question. Because I teach in the School of Medicine, the resistance hasn't come from humanities because most people in the humanities really aren't aware of what it is, but sometimes comes up from some older physicians or more conservative physicians who came from an era of time where the training was such it doesn't allow for this kind of involvement. And so there's resistance in that it's a waste of time. Those are the physicians that I like to then convince to take a workshop with me and do a session with like 6 people over a period of 6 weeks or 6 months. And then they start enjoying what they're writing and they become less suicidal and they start to get a hold of themselves a little bit better. And they're like, oh yes, this does help. So putting them through some of the training is highly effective. When I taught K-12 school, I used to do in-services the same way. I would set up mock situations where the teachers came into the auditorium thinking they were doing creative writing exercises. And I would treat whoever was late with disdain. I would make them the bad kids right away and shun them, and I wouldn't call on them, and they couldn't have snacks. And then about a quarter of the way through, I would reveal that they'd been had and that I just played out what many of them do in their classrooms every day and how it shut down the creative ability of everyone who I villainized for being late, not knowing what their story was. When I was a small child, my mother was suffering full-blown schizophrenia. She was chronically in delusions. And oftentimes I would be late to school because I had to scrub a baseboard with a toothbrush or some crazy thing, or the buggers would come in the house, whatever her delusions were doing. And as a child, I learned very quickly not to cry when they hit you with the board because you were late to school and not to tell them your mother was insane. I didn't cry until I was in my 20s as a result of that treatment. So it's important to me when I'm working with professionals, whether they're physicians or educators, to detail to them what's at stake when they're unwilling to read people they're working with, to ascertain that narrative and to help them be at the next place they need to be and why they're in front of you. Whether they're learning something in the classroom, hopefully, as a K-12 student, or you're dealing with something in their life that's a medical issue that if you don't handle, will not be dealt with. Yeah, long answer, hope helpful.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Allison. I'm going to read a question from Andrea Carter Brown. Andrea writes, having written a lot about trauma in my book, September 12th, I'm most intrigued by your comment about giving yourself PTSD by not dealing with unprocessed material. Could you talk more about that?
Yeah, I'm going to have to read your book now. I was actually working with the classroom, a high school classroom, the morning of September 11th, and turned the class and all of the classes I had that week into ambassadors of peace and told them not to listen to anything that they heard in the news for months and mentioned to them being too young to be in school, but a very, preschool toddler when Kennedy was shot. Nobody knows what happened then. We can't jump to conclusions when these things go on. And so they became translators of peace, and they did an anthology together, and it was called Coming to Life. You can probably still find it on Amazon. And it was stories and principles of peace in times of trauma. When I wrote my memoir, the first time I was in 6th grade, I turned it in for extra credit. The teacher brought in college professors and wanted me to do college classes in the summer and thought she had discovered a child novelist. It was all real. It was my mother's schizophrenia. It was untenable to tell the story. I ran from the class and literally burnt it in a coal stove. I tried when at McDowell years later, and in my last term, or I was post-grad from MFA, I'd done the MFA, I was in a post-grad term, and thought I was going to write poetry, found out that people would actually bring you a basket of food and no one would bother you, and you could live this like perfect poet life where you're totally reclusive and there's deer outside in the woods. And I thought, I'll write that book I threw away in 6th grade. Of course, it'd be different from the years. And I didn't realize I had repressed memories. I thought it was a joke on TV shows. I thought that they were ringers and audiences when these things would happen on talk shows. I didn't believe in repressed memories, literally. And so many came up when I was writing that narrative that I ended up in some real serious PTSD work that I did with the local Air Force Base with the rapid eye movement treatment and such. I'm a daughter of a vet. So I ended up getting actual military deprogramming for my PTSD. It was that chronic. And I didn't press the book for 8 years. Number one, my mother was still very insane when I wrote it. And number two, it damaged me purging the book. In looking at how to prevent that in hindsight, had I been talking to anybody during that time, or even had someone that I trusted well enough to say, I was writing and this thing just happened, there's a rape here. And then I realized it wasn't the first one, and there was this and there was that, and things were popping up that I had just left behind and kept going with. And it damaged me extensively for a while. But in working through those traumas, I used story. I continued to write. I continued to work with my own narrative. I didn't publish as much of it as I thought I would, because some of it was just for sort of soul tending, and taking care of myself in that way. So more journaling. And the rapid eye movement helped a lot. That was a very, very great benefit. Little known fact, if you a child of, no matter the age that you are as an adult, of a veteran of any action anywhere in the world that was a US vet, they have to treat you for free, even if the parent never used the VA. It's covered because they assume that people come home from war with trauma and that kids will have PTSD. That's an assumption. It's interesting, but it's a very little known fact. Luckily, my dad knew it, so I got really good treatment. Was that a helpful answer or not? I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I'm conflating more.
Very helpful. Thank you, Allison.
Thank you.
John, I see your hand is up. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, Allison. Thank you so much for your feeling and your thoughtfulness and the rich and sensitive nuances that you're bringing to, showing us what narrative medicine is, what this, it's so funny this should ring right now, sorry.
It's okay.
The rich and sort of sensitive nuances that you're bringing to us. And I had this question in my mind, and then you shared about your mother. And I said, because my question was, as a poet and writer, what drew you into this work where you're being so empathetic and relational to other people in ways that are, not directly related to writing or, the work of a poet. And what is it about that it feeds you, if I can ask you that? Is there something about it that enriches you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I was raised in a family. My father primarily raised us. Our mother was there when she wasn't in asylum or when we weren't fostered out, but she couldn't participate in the same way that he could, obviously. And he was the kind of person that if you saw something that needed to be done, you were the visionary. It was up to you to do it. And if you had the ability to help, it was your job to help. And it's how we were raised. He also taught us to understand. I mean, it's very hard to have a mother who was suffering from full-blown schizophrenia. There were times where I didn't think I could take it as a youth. And I remember one time challenging my father and saying, "You're like a rock. You're like our rock. And I can't be a rock." And he just smiled for a minute and said, "I never expected you to be a rock. I thought you'd be like the willow and bend with the wind and be supple when things are coming your way." And I felt so embarrassed. And I was like, of course he meant that, So there was this sense of philosophy, of psychology, with the parenting around the trauma we had, many medical issues in the family. There's disabilities. My mother was also blind by age 9. My father was deaf and later went blind. There's a lot of issues in the family. And he always taught us, you know, that if you have the ability to do this very moment, somebody else does not. Step in and do it. It was just a play, and I'm compelled to. I feel some sense of realization when I'm able to go in and modulate a situation, offer hope to someone, offer a sense of forward thinking to someone, break the cycle of suicide, remove somebody from a place that they may never go back to if they transition well enough in the sessions that we're in. Working with criminally insane who are never going to get out of the hospital. It's never going to be different for them. I still feel like there are so few people who will go and work with people who have done heinous things because of medical maladies, that if not me, who? Yeah, so I hope that's helpful.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, Laura. Please feel free to ask your question.
Hi, thank you so much, Allison. I feel like I've learned so much today about the therapeutic aspect of narrative medicine, and I didn't understand that aspect of it, which is clearly fundamental. I'm wondering if you can point to some published writers, particularly poets, who do a particularly fine job of working with similar material in a way that it is not only their own transformation, but then able through really fine art in words to make this larger meaning, continuity, et cetera, that you've referred to available to the reader. I would particularly like to learn from such writers.
Sorry, there are so many, just so many. I wish I'd have come in with a compilation. I may have to put one together and email that to the group. I have a prose writer right away that immediately comes to mind that I'm going to throw in here. And that is because of the conversation we were just having, and had the person before brought up something else, I'd probably have a different thought now. It's how it works, right? Narrativizing. Mira Bartok's The Memory Palace. Exceptional job. And not only dealing with a mother with schizophrenia, her sister also wrote a memoir, Natalia Singer, on their mother's schizophrenia, but also on her own brain trauma. And exemplary field of thought within that work, whereas the audience is also transitioning and learning and growing through the act of the writing of the memoir. It's an amazing and brilliant book. I'd be happy to follow up with a list.
I'd love that. Thank you so much for being willing to do that.
It'd be a pleasure.
Thank you. Hi, Lane.
No, I'd like to say something, and I'm hesitating because this is not my place, but the question that was just asked, I've written a book called Poetic Medicine, the Healing Art of Poem Making. And I believe it addresses pretty exactly what you're asking about.
That's beautiful. Can you put the title in the chat or a link in the chat for us?
Yes, I'm not quite sure. I will do that. Published by Putnam. It's available.
That's beautiful.
Allison, I hope that we can talk later because I'm so glad to hear of what you're doing. And anyway.
I would love to. I'm also going to put just some little loose threads here. When I'm teaching narrative medicine, narrative pathways, these are some of the things that I like to handle in a classroom, in a workshop, in a setting. And sometimes I'm doing this through exercises, other times it's through discourse and or lecture, depending on setting. But these 7 principles within narrative medicine, I think are very helpful. So sharing those as well, and some links to some programs.
Thank you, Allison. These are excellent resources, and I'm copying them as she's putting them in. I wanted to. I have a question, which is dealing with a different aspect of this. I wrote a memoir about from the place of trauma about our kids' adoption from the foster system, right?
Okay.
And what I noticed that over the years of writing and rewriting is that it's so hard to separate that voice, the traumatized voice of self-pity, of sort of like being overly confessional, and just kind of having everything done and said and ready for, with conclusions and all, to the voice that will actually allow reader to really experience it and participate. So I noticed that, like, I would say probably my last three writes were the ones that were beginning to kind of get me there. And so how do you separate, like, I'm sorry about that. How do you separate yourself from the experience in the way that you can actually tell it?
Yeah. I had an interesting experience, just speaking firsthand, personal. Um, Years ago, I tend to write long poems when dealing with sort of epic experiences. And this one poem that I had was in music in my head. I really think in music, and I had the music for almost a year before I went to the page, and then the words were there, and I went to the page and wrote this piece. It's called "Do You Hear the Rat?" And it's about the time me and my kids got bubonic plague, leaving a domestic violence situation by the skin of my teeth. Would not have lived had I have stayed. Children may not have either. And we moved into what I did not know was a rat den, literally. So I spent nights in a crib with kids fighting off rats that have bubonic plague, which can be really crazy, wharf rats. I had a 2-liter glass bottle in one hand back in those days and a hammer in the other, protecting babies from these rats. And we all got plague. So years later, I was writing poetry. I didn't necessarily want anyone to know that I lived like that in those years. I'm older now, I don't really care. But at that time, I was worried about what people would think, that I was in that kind of a situation. So writing third person into the poem. And I had a stunning thing happen toward the end of the poem. And I had to go back to the beginning to find out why that happened. But we often preface things and give precursors of things because we're writers without even thinking about it. It happens naturally for us when we're working in narrative of some sorts, even poetic narrative. I had put early on, I can only spectate, talking about watching her, this person that is now the third person that the poem is about. And all of a sudden in the hospital, which is a real situation, when they're trying to bring me back into the body, when they're using the jumper cables and all the things they do to revive you, and I'm making the decision floating around the room. Suddenly in the poem, while talking about the person going through these things, I say, and I have been here all along, floating around this room. I feel free enough to dance. And it was the first time that I had come into the poem, except the very early window of the narrator saying I can only spectate. But it took that long in the poem for me to move into the I, because I was reclaiming the body in the poem. But it was also the first place in the poem I felt that I didn't have to distract myself from it to write it, because otherwise I would have succumbed to the memory of it. So by keeping the I out until I was ready to accept moving back into the physical self and the actual story of the thing, I was able to stay distant from it and write it from this witnessing point of view. But isn't that what we do, is disassociate? Now, in some senses, in the medical field, this can be seen as something that's almost an illness and or becomes an illness, the disassociative quality. In a sense of coping, we almost always disassociate. Adrenaline slows us down in a trauma so that we can unfold solutions and possibilities, because we're backtracking our life to see what tools we have, what our knowns are, where we can fire from if we're going to survive this thing. And so as the adrenaline slows us down, we have all of our memory and our abilities more present for us. And it seems like everything is really slow, and we can access things and sort of do this miracle work with adrenaline. We have more strength. We're seeing things in a way. I mentioned early on a predator bird, a falcon, can see 2 miles. We can't fathom what that is. We can't really fathom what we're on when we have adrenaline rush like that in a near-death incident, but it slows us down enough to have ability if we're to survive the situation. So some dissociative patterning that we have is also part of our coping, part of our moving to solutions, and part of ascertaining what an actual scene is, so we know the dilemma, so we can deal with the dilemma and find the solution. So I always suggest, first and foremost, removing oneself from it and allowing the story to play out as though watching cinema, and just allowing yourself to be in that seat watching the cinema unfold. Number one, it's going to make the writing much more beautiful because you're allowing it to play out without your invested interest in it. And number two, you're not re-traumatizing yourself at the same time. So I always suggest people step out. I learned it the hard way, both with the memoir, also writing poems, divulging things, and not wanting to be confessional. So somebody else lived through this, not me. Oh, here's the eye, but there is a value in that. I hope it's helpful.
It is, and just one thing to add to what you were saying is that when you do that, you actually begin to see other people in a more three-dimensional way. It becomes a much richer narrative.
Even yourself, you see as
And
full
yourself.
character, instead of this idea we have of self, which is often not what other people think at all. Right? We'll notice nuance of self, which is not apparent to us because we're inhabiting, right? Thank you so much. Beautiful.
Thank you.
And thank you for doing your work, all of you. Thank you, everyone, for doing what you're doing. It's so important.
I think we have time for one more question out of the chat. So Ricardo, I'll let you choose.
Oh no, I can't choose because Seba, I see your hand is up.
Okay. Okay, let's do two more questions then. And
Let's do
then
two more. Would you like to ask your question, Seba?
Sure. Hi, Allison. So great to see you.
Hi. I see you again. It's nice to see you.
Virtual hug.
A hug for you.
And you too. That was just so beautiful. I'm so glad I can do the safe chat. So I have everything. I don't have to hurry and take notes. My question was about the time in which we are right now, which is we are not post-COVID. We are still in COVID. There's all this violence. And what is the trauma that you're seeing in the program at this point? Do you see the reflections of that, or is it removed?
In the medical program at School of Medicine? Okay, I want to brag just a moment, if you will allow me. I think I have bragging rights. It made national news. Our School of Medicine was only virtual, Zoom, these kinds of things for about a month. And we applied every single bit of advice to keep people safe that the CDC originally said, and have not deviated from that. We've had no breakthrough cases at all, which is phenomenal. And it's on campus elsewhere. We're back to mandated mask on campus as a result, but the School of Medicine's had no breakthrough. We did have to pull our residents out, and I say we broadly because I'm not an administrator, but we had to pull our residents out of several residencies because they didn't have the PPEs, they weren't able to provide for them, and we had to keep the students safe. So here's what happened as a result. Other students started manufacturing them in different areas and created this resource to allow our students to continue working and actually help the community. So they literally started manufacturing what was not put into place. I am working with honor students. Actually, I think most of the honor students I've worked with have been doing a minor in medical humanities, most of them in narrative medicine, while they're residents. And so when they get to their capstone part of the course, they have to do an extensive body of research, and in my case, creative work that accompanies it. And they've been writing their experiences in dealing with people with COVID in the hospital and attending to patients. And so at the same time that they have been learning to work with the patients from this standpoint, they're also using it for themselves in order to cope, to survive, to deal with the situation at hand, which is incredible. I do want to recommend a book that is called Inflamed, and it is by, I've lost the name, and not a good noun name day for me. Give me just a second. She's incredible. I know her, so I'm having a hard time that I've forgotten her name. Rupa Marya and Raj Patel. It is a fantastic text. It is called Inflamed, and it speaks to all sorts of critical things that we're dealing with in westernized medicine, colonized medicine, and in the field of medicine during times such as this pandemic. It just came out last August. It's brilliant. Yeah, she teaches at UC San Francisco. Wonderful. She's also a front man in a band, great singer, great musician, and wonderful physician.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for coming. It's so wonderful to see you.
Lovely to see you too.
So good to see you. Yes. Thank you, John. I remembered you suddenly. I think we were at Bishop, California together in the early 90s, mid 90s, maybe late 90s.
Yeah, who was our host? Eva Poole Gilson.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Hi.
I worked with you back then at Bishop.
Will Staple and
Yeah.
California Poets in the Schools.
Yes, I was a regional coordinator. And
Oh,
yes, back in the day. I just remembered you when you put your book up. I go, I know him. We had great talks back then.
well,
Yeah,
good.
good.
I'm glad to hear you now.
Wonderful to see you.
Yeah.
Thank
One
you.
more question from the chat.
One more. So Patrick, would you like to ask your question on the mic?
Yes, thank you. It was a great presentation, Allison. I really appreciate hearing, all the perspectives. My question was just, I work with rare disease patients as part of a patient support and advocacy group. And we see many patients, submit their personal stories, their diagnosis journeys, their, misdiagnosis journeys, treatments, all of that. And, most of these people, they're not writers, or they don't think of themselves as writers, but they want to share their story. And it's clear that just the act of sharing that is really beneficial to them. And it's, really beneficial to other people who are at different points in that journey. I guess what I'm wondering, is there like a good next step for those people who have shared their stories, and a lot of them share them publicly in like our organization's magazine or on our website or even at events. And then, what I haven't figured out is kind of that next step for them. Is there something I can do to help them further, or to encourage them if they're not used to, being a writer, or they don't think of themselves in that way?
Yeah. Would you be willing to give me an email, and I'll set up a little brief session with you?
Okay,
And,
that'd be awesome.
Yeah, I'll do a little pro bono with you.
Oh, wow. Thank you.
It's necessary, and I'd be happy to do that. Yeah, there's a lot that you can put into
I'm sure
play.
there must be.
And a lot of things, but I'll want to ask you a few questions first about situation, and then I can give you some ways that you can field that furthering.
Sure. I think I have your email in the chat. So
I put it in the chat. It's just
Okay.
AllisonH@ucr.edu.
Oh, wow. Thank you. That's wonderful.
Thank you, and thank you for your work as well. Thank you so much.
Also, I will send a roster out of everyone who is here, and I will try to include a copy of the chat for anyone who wasn't able to grab it before we conclude. So that will come after the meeting, probably early next week. I wish we could use, part of me wishes we could use all the time to just keep Allison talking to us. But I also want to give you a chance to share some news and updates with each other in the last 20 minutes or so. And then I'm gonna just give you a little bit of an update on our mini grants program for writers and event coordinators at the very end. So I just want to thank Allison for sharing her time and wealth of wisdom and experience with us. Thank you so much. And open it up to folks who might have announcements. We'll do it the same way with the raising of the hands and the info in the chat. Feel free to post in there. I do want to announce something from Poets and Writers, which is that Allison is going to be joining us again in late July for our annual workshop Leaders Retreat. This is an event that is designed for teaching writers who work with underserved or marginalized groups. So it's a very specific group. It is free. And if you are interested in joining us for that, if you work with these groups as a writer teaching creative writing, then please feel free to reach out to me and I will be sure to include you on the announcement when the announcement goes out for registrations. Because it's free, it is, kind of first come, first served until we reach our capacity head count. So with that, I'll open it up to your announcements. I'm going to call on someone though first, because I know, John, you already said that you wanted to speak a little bit about the Institute.
Oh,
And let everyone know what that is.
okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm just so grateful to Allison for her presentation here, and I kind of feel I want that to kind of fill up the space. But in 2005, we founded the Institute for Poetic Medicine, and in ways that I think resonate very much with the way Allison has presented things, reaching out to provide funded programs to, quote, marginalized people, although nobody in their own self is really at any margin. But the Institute has been doing this for 17 years. And we've been also expanding by offering programs. For instance, in latter part of this month, there'll be a 6-part series called Social Justice, using poetry and poem making in, exploring issues of social justice. Later this summer, I'll offer something we're called Poems of Witness, Climate Action. And so those are specific things that people are interested in finding out about. They can go to the website, poeticmedicine.org. Very keen to hear other people's experience and what you're doing. And if you're bringing poetry, to people, and in whatever way you're doing that, I'd be interested in hearing about it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jamie.
Is there anyone else who would like to share events or programs with the group? Hilda, I see your hand up.
Hi, I'm happy to announce that Poetry.la has a new interview up with Will Alexander, interviewed by Douglas Manuel. And you can go to Poetry.la, that's our website, and see the interview. Will Alexander was a finalist, one of 2, I think, for the current Pulitzer Prize in poetry. So come take a look. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilda. And Douglas Manuel is a really great poet also, and has taught creative writing workshops to foster youth in LA through Poets and Writers mini grants. So all connections here through and through. Any other announcements, events that you want to share that you're involved with? Don't be shy. Now's the time.
Hi, it's Millicent. I don't have my picture up, so I don't have my hand to be raised.
Okay.
I put in there, I just wanted to give a little shout out. My reading series, Loose Lips, has a feature in June, and we have David Oliveira and Carl Markham as our featured poets. And the details are on the Poets and Writers calendar, and it's June 21st.
Great. And is that is on Zoom or virtual or in person?
It's on Zoom. The library that we had been using for in-person readings, the county library, LA County Library, is not open yet. So they're looking at maybe fall, but I just talked to the librarian yesterday. So they're still not doing in-person events. So we're on Zoom for the duration, but we're on it for June. So they're going to take another look-see in October.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. Wonderful reading series out of Topanga, right?
Yeah, Topanga Canyon.
Anyone else would like to share upcoming events? All right, well, I'm gonna move into a little bit of update on our Readings and Workshops mini grants program. We have closed out funding for this fiscal year, but the happy news is that there's a new fiscal year, which begins July 1st. So we are accepting applications for literary events with poets, fiction writers, or creative nonfiction writers taking place from July through June. And these mini grants go to the writer who might be giving a reading or teaching a creative writing workshop. The event coordinator of an organization must apply on behalf of the writer. So writers can't apply for themselves, but it is a really easy application. And we have links that we've put in the chat to the application system, to the guidelines, and it's very easy to apply. It takes about 15 to 20 minutes maybe. And what was I gonna say? Lost my train of thought. We have toolkits that give you step-by-step instructions on how to apply. And we are funding virtual events, in-person events, and hybrid events. So all events, however you are putting them on, as long as they are live, presented live. So I encourage you to apply, and we are especially interested in funding writing workshops that reach underserved or marginalized groups. We are invested in serving writers of color, and we will work with you if you have any questions about how to apply or if your event qualifies. So don't be shy. Feel free to reach out to either me or Ricardo or both of us if you have events coming up. And we are also interested in funding events throughout the state of California. So if you are in a rural area, we certainly would love to help you put on a literary event if that is something you're interested in doing. Last but not least, I've included some resources in the agenda from poets and writers for you to check out, from our literary magazines database to our online literary events calendar. I hope you will leverage all of these tools to promote your events and to find resources for yourselves as writers in the community. So with that, I think I'm going to say, wish you all well and thank you for being here, for joining us. I'm going to send the roster and the chat, and I'm also going to invite you to join our California Literary Listserv, which is a great place to share news and events easily. That is not Facebook, that is not Instagram, but just an old-fashioned email listserv, which sometimes is kind of nice. So thank you all again, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. And thank you so much, Allison. We'll see you at the Workshop Leaders Retreat.
See you. Thank you so much, everyone.